HOA Karen held a wine tasting on my porch, so I turned on the sprinklers mid-sip. When Thomas Granger returned from his fishing trip, the last thing he expected was to find wine glasses clinking on his porch and strangers relaxing on his late wife's favorite swing. The air in Willow Creek still held the scent of honeysuckle, and the gravel under Thomas's boots gave its familiar crunch as he approached his white house with green shutters. His truck door creaked shut behind him, the bed still carrying tackle boxes and an old ice chest that had leaked faint traces of river water and catfish. He was bone-tired, looking forward to a hot shower, a reheated plate of meatloaf, and a quiet evening beneath the wisteria vines that draped across his porch like green lace. Instead, he found folding tables covered in white linen and cheese boards arranged with manicured precision. Clusters of neighbors, most of whom he barely recognized, milled about holding stemmed glasses, their conversation a polite hum over the soft background of classical music leaking from a Bluetooth speaker perched beside his geraniums. On the swing, the one he and Charlotte had built together from reclaimed pine, sat a woman in floral print laughing at something a man with two white teeth had said. Her heel tapped against the side rail, leaving a faint smudge. Thomas stood motionless at the bottom step. A man in khakis and boat shoes approached him with a Chardonnay in hand. "You must be the host," he said brightly. "This place is charming. The porch light? Very Gatsby." Thomas blinked, still trying to make sense of it. Karen Billings emerged like a well-rehearsed theater actress hitting her cue. She wore a wide-brimmed sun hat and a smile polished to perfection. "Thomas, you're back early," she sang, gliding across the porch with a clipboard in hand. "We thought you'd be gone through the weekend. I hope it's okay. We needed a venue with character." He stared at her, his voice still missing. She gestured around as if she owned the air. "The HOA decided to kick off our summer sip series. We were short on locations, and your porch was just sitting here, so inviting. Southern charm, lovely symmetry, what's not to love?" Thomas finally stepped forward, his boots making deliberate contact with the bottom stair. "This is my porch." "Oh, don't be like that," Karen cooed, her voice skimming the surface of patronizing. "We only borrowed it. You weren't using it, and the photographer said this angle is perfect at golden hour." He said nothing, just turned, walked through his front door, and closed it behind him with a quiet that felt like a slammed door. Inside, the air was cooler, dimmer. The smell of varnish from an old project still lingered faintly in the den. He moved with practiced ease, setting down his keys, ignoring the mingled chatter filtering through the window screen. He started the coffee pot, knowing it wouldn't help the ache in his jaw. Then his eyes landed on the swing. Out the window, Charlotte's varnished job, meticulous and done one spring morning while sipping sweet tea, was now smudged with fingerprints and a red wine ring. She used to polish it every Easter weekend. Said the porch was the only place in the world where she truly exhaled. His fingers curled slowly into fists. On the mantel, a framed photo of Charlotte holding a bushel of tomatoes looked down at him with her usual mix of affection and warning. She had always known the value of boundaries. "This porch was built with love, not for show," she used to say. "Don't let anyone turn it into a stage." He stepped across the living room and opened a drawer in the old oak desk. Inside was a tan folder, yellowed slightly at the edges, labeled in Charlotte's handwriting. Deed and letters, Charlotte. The ink had faded, but the intent was still bold. He held the folder without opening it, just feeling its weight in his hands. There had never been a need to fight before. Never been a reason to think the community might forget the difference between borrowed charm and earned peace. Outside, laughter rang out, a sharp tinkling kind, and someone cranked up the music. He heard the creak of the swing. The creak that used to say, "She's reading." The creak that once held stories and secrets and the silence only two people could share without awkwardness. Thomas exhaled slowly, then walked to the hall closet and retrieved the porch light bulb Charlotte had saved from their first anniversary. He used to joke that it was their lucky charm, because it only flickered during storms. He placed it on the side table by the door, next to the deed, then opened the front door. The crowd was still gathered, Karen now handing out pamphlets about upcoming HOA events. Thomas stepped onto the porch, calm as ever, folder tucked under one arm. Several heads turned. Karen brightened and waved. He didn't wave back. "I hope you all brought umbrellas for next week." At the monthly HOA meeting, Thomas doesn't raise his voice, He just asks a question that makes everyone uncomfortable. The folding chairs in the clubhouse creaked like they had opinions. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, flickering slightly, casting a pale tint over the mismatched faces of Willow Creek's more involved citizens. Thomas sat at the edge of the room, his elbows resting on a plastic folding table that wobbled every time someone shifted too hard. The room smelled faintly of burnt coffee and lemon-scented floor polish. Karen stood near the front with her clipboard, tapping it occasionally against her thigh like a metronome. She wore a sleeveless blouse and a peach-colored scarf, and her voice carried with practiced authority. As part of our community engagement initiative, she said, last week's summer sip kickoff was a rousing success. Wonderful turnout, excellent feedback. Several heads nodded. Thomas cleared his throat once. Then again, louder. Karen hesitated. Yes, Mr. Granger? He didn't stand. He didn't need to. I'd like to know who gave you permission to host an event on my porch. There was a moment, just a beat, when the whole room felt colder. Someone shifted a cup, and it echoed far too loud. Greg Harmon coughed, but didn't look up. Marty, the HOA treasurer, stared at the table like it might sprout wings. Karen offered a smile dipped in condescension. We assumed it would be fine. The HOA guidelines, section 6.4b, do allow for temporary use of community-facing structures for special events. Thomas tilted his head. So you're saying my porch is a community structure? Karen's smile thinned. It faces the street, doesn't it? Marty fumbled with a binder and began reading. Section 6.4b. Communal use allowances may include shared lawns, fences, or structures visible from the public easement. He trailed off. Well, it's a little unclear. Thomas reached into his satchel and produced a crisp manila envelope. This is my deed. The porch is part of my home, not a gazebo. Karen waved a dismissive hand. If you believe there's been a misstep, you're welcome to file a formal complaint. But let's not make a fuss over a bit of wine and community spirit. He didn't reply, just placed the envelope gently on the table in front of him. From the corner of the room, a voice piped up, casual but clear. That clause doesn't apply to primary dwellings. The speaker was a woman in her 30s, glasses perched halfway down her nose, dark hair tied back in a no-nonsense bun. She wore jeans and a faded t-shirt that read, I read contracts for fun. Karen stiffened. I'm sorry, and you are? Marcy Tran, she said, standing. I work remote for a title company in D.C. used to do zoning law. That clause you cited? It's meant for park benches and mail kiosks, not private residences. Marty blinked. Are you sure? Marcy nodded. Positive. I can pull up the state code if you like. Karen's lips pressed into a pale line. Let's not get bogged down in semantics. It's not semantics, Thomas said quietly. It's my home. After the meeting, most people filtered out quickly, murmuring goodbyes and avoiding eye contact. A few nodded to Thomas with tight smiles. Lisa Harmon offered a week, hope it gets sorted, before following her husband out. Marcy approached with a folder tucked under her arm. You handled that well, she said. A lot of folks would have yelled. I was raised better, he replied. I meant what I said about the clause. If you want to push back, I can help. Thomas hesitated, then nodded. Might take you up on that. Back at the house, the porch was mercifully empty. The wine stains still marred the wood near the swing, a red smear that felt like a bruise. He made a cup of weak diner-style coffee and sat in his rocker as dusk began its slow descent. He didn't want to be in a fight. He wanted things simple, the way they'd been when Charlotte was alive. Quiet meals, radio in the background, porch light flickering in the rain. The mail hadn't been checked since he got back, and he opened the small box beside the front steps to find a few flyers and one envelope. Inside, folded carefully, was a note from Charlotte. Handwritten, probably found and forwarded by her sister. The paper had softened at the edges, the ink just barely holding fast. This porch is where we kept the world at bay. Guard it well. He sat with that line for a long time, long enough that the evening cicadas took over the silence. The house groaned once behind him. Somewhere down the block, a car door slammed. When he finally stood, he walked inside without a word, placed the note in the folder with the deed, and turned to the phone. The HOA might not listen to logic, but maybe they'd listen to water pressure. He dialed the number scratched on a business card pinned to the fridge, and when the clerk at Willow Creek Hardware answered, he said, "What's the most powerful sprinkler timer you've got?" Saturday afternoon. Linen dresses, sunglassed guests, and chilled rose. And beneath the porch, sprinkler nozzles, primed and humming. The sun lit Willow Creek like it had been hired for the occasion, casting a warm sheen over hydrangeas and freshly mowed lawns. Birds flitted between feeders. Wind moved softly through the wisteria above Thomas Granger's porch, rustling Charlotte's old wind chime with a sound so familiar it almost sounded like her sighing. A trio of pastel-draped women giggled as they adjusted folding chairs just outside Thomas's porch steps. Their heels sunk slightly into the grass, and one of them swatted the air and muttered about the heat. A man in khakis and a straw hat uncorked another bottle of rose, the glass sweating in the early June warmth. Thomas watched from behind his screen door, invisible and uninvited. He'd been up early. The flower beds had been tidied by the HOA the previous afternoon, which meant someone had trampled his begonias and rearranged his lawn gnomes like they were auditioning for a ballet. He spent the morning quietly restoring order, then wiring the porch. It wasn't much, just a series of sprinkler heads hidden beneath the porch railings, nestled among potted herbs and blooming violet. He'd installed the system years ago to keep the grass alive during droughts. Today, it had a more focused purpose. Inside, the remote sat on the table beside a glass of iced tea and the folder marked Deed and Letters, Charlotte. The hummingbird feeder swayed just outside the window, a tiny blur of wings hovering near its edge. A good omen, if Charlotte were here to say so. Marcy had texted that she'd be nearby, just in case. Thomas turned his attention back outside. Karen Billings stood at the front of the porch like a cruise director, clipboard tucked beneath one arm, microphone in hand. "We're so excited to kick off our summer Sip and Savor series right here at the heart of Willow Creek," she trilled. "Let's raise our glasses to neighborly unity." A smattering of applause followed. Glasses clinked. Someone asked aloud where the cheese board had gone. Thomas reached for the remote. He didn't grin, didn't blink. He simply pressed the button. There was a soft click beneath the floorboards, followed by a brief, quiet pause, as though the earth itself were inhaling. Then, chaos. Water erupted in shimmering arcs across the porch and lawn, drenching tablecloths, splattering wine glasses, and sending startled guests scrambling in all directions. A woman shrieked as a spray hit her directly in the back. Karen, halfway through her next sentence, was cut off mid-word as a stream nailed her square in the chest, darkening her peach blouse in a perfect triangle. "What on earth?" she sputtered, spinning in place, now soaked from the knees down. Thomas stepped onto the porch. He was wearing his usual jeans, button-down shirt, and work boots. The remote still sat loosely in his hand. "You sabotaged us," Karen shouted, mascara beginning to smudge at the corners. Thomas remained calm. "You were warned." More guests shrieked as another round of sprinklers cycled through. A man slipped on the wet grass and fell into the punch table. Someone's chiffon scarf floated like seaweed in the bird bath. A sheriff's cruiser pulled up at the curb. Out stepped Officer Redmond, broad-shouldered, slow-moving, and visibly unimpressed. He removed his sunglasses with the same measured pace he used in high school when delivering lecture day warnings in Mr. Granger's history class. He took one look at the scene, then made his way up the soggy steps. "Afternoon," he said mildly. Someone called in a disturbance. Karen turned on him. "This man attacked us with lawn equipment. He's harassing the HOA. Redmond raised an eyebrow. "With sprinklers?" "It's targeted," she snapped, arms flailing. "He drenched our event." Redmond looked over at Thomas. "You got your papers?" Without a word, Thomas handed over the folder. Redmond flipped it open, reading through the deed first. Then, carefully, he unfolded the notarized letter, signed in Charlotte's distinctive cursive. The paper declared the porch a private, protected domestic space, specifically referenced in her will. Redmond took his time. He looked up, cleared his throat, and said, "Ma'am, you're trespassing." The word landed like a dropped gavel. Karen's mouth opened, then closed. A spot of wine had bloomed on her sleeve, and her hat had gone lopsided. "But the HOA charter doesn't override property deeds," Redmond said simply, "or a will." The guests, now damp and demoralized, began to disperse. Some helped one another down the stairs. A few chuckled under their breath. One man in a lavender polo whispered, "Well, that was refreshing," before hurrying after his wife. Thomas stood silently. The wind chime clinked again. Karen remained, dripping, her shoes squelching on the wet boards. She took one step forward, leaned in close enough for Thomas to see the fury etched beneath her mascara, and whispered, "Then I guess we'll just take this to a vote." Thomas didn't hire a lawyer. He walked into Marcy's garage, holding a slice of lemon pie and a binder labeled The Porch War. The garage door was cracked just enough to let in the late afternoon light. A fan oscillated in one corner, its rhythmic ticking barely louder than the clink of glass jars and old paint cans stacked on a shelf. Legal books were piled next to a bin of gardening gloves, and a pin board, once used for seed catalogs, was now covered in printouts, maps, and post-it notes with fierce red underlines. Marcy Tran sat cross-legged on a milk crate, her laptop balanced on a folding table that had seen better potlucks. She looked up as Thomas entered and grinned. "Pie before paperwork? You're my kind of client." "I'm not paying you," Thomas said, handing her the plate. "And I'm not your client. Yet." She winked, then gestured to a chair beside her. "All right, General Granger, what's our strategy?" Thomas set the binder down. "We're not going to win this with sprinklers again." Marcy pulled up a document on her screen. "Good, because Karen's doubling down. She sent out a memo last night citing Section 6.4b again. Claims visible community-facing structures are under flexible use provisions during seasonal events. She just made that up, didn't she? Technically, she cherry-picked. Let me show you." Marcy rotated her laptop so Thomas could see. The HOA charter, scanned from a 2007 revision, flickered under the cursor. Marcy highlighted a paragraph near the bottom. It says shared non-primary structures. That means clubhouses, mail kiosks, maybe the retention pond if someone gets creative. Not your porch. Your porch is a primary structure attached to a singularly owned dwelling. Thomas gave a small, approving grunt. "But here's the kicker," she said, digging into another stack. "I pulled county records. This map from 1972 here." She slid a yellowing land survey across the table. "See that line? That's the edge of your property. It falls just outside the HOA's official annexation from 1991. They never updated it to include your lot." He traced the line with a calloused finger. "So technically, you're not under HOA jurisdiction. Not by land, not by code." Thomas leaned back, letting the fan sweep warm air over his arms. "Why hasn't anyone noticed this before?" "Because no one ever challenged it," Marcy said. "Karen just assumed everyone was inside her fence. You were too polite to correct her. Charlotte always said live and let live, until someone moves your fence without asking." Marcy clicked her tongue. "Well, your fence is intact, and we're going to make sure they know it." That night, as fireflies began blinking along the hedgerows, Thomas and Marcy sat at the folding table and drafted a formal rebuttal, a summary of legal boundaries, clauses misapplied, and a scanned copy of the 1972 survey. Marcy added citations, language precise enough to hold up in front of a county clerk. Marty, the HOA treasurer, had been eerily quiet since the sprinkler incident. But earlier that afternoon, Thomas found an unmarked envelope in his mailbox. Inside were notes from the last 3 HOA meetings, including one marked confidential in Karen's bold handwriting. Discuss expansion of community engagement zones. Porch visibility key. Phase 2. Formalize shared spaces including 115 Willow, Granger property, under event umbrella. Thomas stared at that line for a long time. They sent the rebuttal to the HOA board, CC'd every neighbor in the mailing list, and attached the survey for good measure. The next morning, an official reply came through. It wasn't from the board. It was from Karen. "This community deserves a voice. We will vote on it." The font was large, the tone unapologetic. She'd included a flyer mock-up for the HOA Community Unity vote, scheduled to take place next week, front lawn of the clubhouse. Thomas closed the laptop. He walked out to the porch with his second cup of coffee and settled into the rocker Charlotte had refinished. The wood creaked softly under his weight, steady and familiar. The breeze carried the smell of cut grass and honeysuckle. He looked out at the quiet street, Greg mowing his lawn 2 doors down, a kid chasing a soccer ball across the cul-de-sac, someone walking a basset hound that looked older than time. He didn't frown, didn't sigh. He just rocked once, then said to himself, "Let him bring chairs. I've got the porch." Folding chairs lined the curb. Someone even brought a podium. Thomas watched from behind the screen door, sipping coffee from a chipped mug that read "History Happens Here." The sun hung low over Willow Creek, casting soft orange light across the neighborhood. The air was still, but tense, as if the street itself was holding its breath. What had been a quiet front yard for most of the last 30 years now resembled a town square in miniature. A line of paper lanterns stretched across the lawn. HOA banners fluttered gently. On the table near the porch, a sweating pitcher of sweet tea sat untouched. Thomas leaned slightly forward in his rocker. He saw Marcy near the front, clipboard in hand, standing alone by the mailbox. She wore her usual jeans and a linen blouse, eyes scanning the crowd as if taking inventory of possible reinforcements. Greg and Lisa Harmon, who'd remained silent through most of the conflict, sat stiffly in the second row. Charlotte used to joke, "You can't vote someone off their porch." He smiled faintly, the echo of her voice soft in his ears. Karen arrived 5 minutes late, her timing intentional. She stepped out of a glossy SUV and glided toward the podium like a politician approaching the cameras. Her dress was pressed, her hair lacquered, her expression the picture of composed purpose. "Good evening, friends and neighbors," she began, voice amplified through a small wireless mic clipped to her collar. "Tonight isn't about disagreement, it's about unity. It's about using our beautiful spaces for the greater good." Thomas remained seated. No microphone, no podium. "I've lived in this house for 32 years, he began, his voice calm but carried. "I watched most of your children learn to ride bikes on this street. Charlotte and I hosted potlucks, Halloween cider nights, and a dozen quiet anniversaries right here on this porch. We never once locked the front gate, because we trusted our neighbors." A few heads turned toward him. "She used to say this porch kept the world at bay," Thomas continued. "We didn't build it to make a statement. We built it to last. And we never thought we'd need to defend it." He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. Marcy stepped forward next, as planned. She carried a file in one hand and a rolled-up survey map in the other. "If I may," she said, unfolding the documents on the folding table beside the podium. "This is a legal map from 1972, showing the original property boundaries for 115 Willow. This house and this porch fall outside the HOA's jurisdiction. Always have." A murmur ran through the audience. "Furthermore," she said, holding up a highlighted page, "the clause the HOA cited, Section 6.4b, only applies to shared non-primary structures. This is a private porch attached to a primary dwelling. It's not shared. It's not available for public scheduling." Karen stepped forward, visibly irate but still composed. "This is about neighborly access, about community engagement. Our bylaws are flexible, and this vote." Greg Harmon stood up. He didn't raise a hand or ask permission. He just stood. "That porch raised my kids," he said. "We used to sit out there after soccer practice. Charlotte let our youngest nap on that swing when the power went out. It's not a venue. It's a home." Lisa stood with him. Karen's eyes narrowed. "We can't let precedent be dictated by sentiment." From the edge of the gathering, a familiar figure stepped forward. Officer Redmond, in uniform but off-duty, holding his phone. "I've just confirmed with the county registrar," he said, voice low and even. "The HOA never formally annexed this property. It's outside your reach. This vote holds no legal weight. Case closed." The silence that followed was sharp. Karen's face tightened. For a moment, she looked as though she might argue anyway, some final desperate flourish. But the words didn't come. Fireflies blinked lazily in the hedges. She turned, stepped down from the podium, and began walking toward her SUV. No one followed. No one clapped. The next morning, the sun rose over Willow Creek, and for the first time in weeks, Thomas's porch was empty, except for peace. Birdsong filtered through the dogwoods as light spilled across the wisteria-draped railing. The porch swing creaked gently in the breeze, moving just enough to suggest someone had been there recently, even if only in memory. The air carried the faint scent of varnish and cut grass, fresh from Thomas's early morning touch-up on the banister. A new hummingbird feeder hung beside the chimes, catching the light like a prism. Inside the house, Thomas washed his paintbrush in the utility sink, the cool water swirling pale blue before vanishing down the drain. There was no more strategy, no waiting game. The vote had come and gone, and for once, silence didn't feel like a warning. It felt like a reward. Around mid-morning, there was a knock at the door. Greg and Lisa stood outside, modest smiles and a Tupperware dish between them. "We made lemon bars," Lisa said, holding out the container. And this. She passed him a small card. Inside, just one word, sorry. Thomas took it with a nod. You didn't have to. Maybe not, Greg said. But it felt right. They stayed for coffee, which turned into sweet tea when Sandra from down the street walked by with a tray of peach cobbler and decided to stay. Before long, a folding table had been dragged from Thomas's garage and set up under the oak tree, draped with a checkered cloth that Charlotte had once used for 4th of July picnics. Someone brought fried chicken. Someone else set out a bowl of coleslaw. There were no sign-up sheets, no welcome speeches, just neighbors arriving with dishes and stories, and an unspoken sense that something small but sacred had been reclaimed. Marcy showed up with a manila envelope and a hand-painted sign tucked under her arm. The HOA's going through its quiet phase, she said. Karen's resignation letter was tacked to the clubhouse board. Stress leave, apparently. She handed Thomas the sign, painted in elegant strokes over wood, not public, just welcoming. He smiled. You've got an artist's hand. I had a good subject. Donna came by later, leaning on a cane but sharp-eyed. A retired lawyer who'd been quietly watching the whole showdown from her flower-lined porch 2 blocks over. She brought deviled eggs and offered Thomas her business card. If anyone else needs help pushing back, you point them to me, she said. Retirement's boring, and this community just remembered it has a backbone. The day stretched lazily toward dusk. Kids ran barefoot in the grass, chasing fireflies. Someone turned on soft music from a Bluetooth speaker. Laughter bubbled through the hedges and up the porch steps like rising bread. As the sky turned violet, Thomas found himself alone again for a moment. The porch was calm, humming with the gentle buzz of a space finally allowed to breathe. On the railing sat a small envelope with no return address. He opened it slowly, expecting a leftover flyer or misplaced bill. Instead, inside was a single folded note. Thank you for reminding us what ownership really means. A former foe. Thomas smiled quietly, folding the note and tucking it behind the hummingbird feeder string where it caught the last amber glow of evening. He rose, stretched, and stepped to the porch light switch. The bulb Charlotte loved flickered on, just once, before casting its steady, golden glow over the yard. Still smiling, he whispered to no one in particular, still standing. The porch had always been more than wood and nails. It was memory, boundary, and quiet defiance wrapped in wisteria and wind chimes. After all the noise, what remained was something deeper, a community that had remembered how to listen, and a man who chose dignity over bitterness. Sometimes, the strongest fences are built not with boards, but with quiet resolve and a neighbor's respect. And when the porch light flickers back on after a storm, it doesn't just light up the steps. It reminds us who still stands on them.